Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you very much, Tom and Anne, for your warm welcome. And last week I attended somebody else's professorial when the person who was giving it said he didn't recognise himself in the introduction, and I have to say I hardly recognise myself either. So thank you very much for such kind words. I'm very touched that so many of my family, friends, university colleagues in government and in the voluntary and community sector are able to be here this evening. As Tom said, you're most welcome to the Magee campus of the University of Ulster, a campus of which we are all justifiably proud. Anne mentioned that Jeffrey Cook had come up from Dublin today to join us for this lecture, and he hasn't been in Derry for I think 8 or 9 years. He's been absolutely amazed by the transformation in the city, and that's only been surpassed by the transformation in this campus in that time. And I think it is a very exciting part of the university to be involved in, and I'm very proud of it. Before moving on to the lecture proper, I'd like to take this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to publicly acknowledge people who have supported and enabled me in my career. I can't mention everyone, but some key people I would like to mention. First, of course, thanks to Keith and the kids, David and Tori, who constantly remind me about the really important things in life. My parents, Sylvia and Val, who have encouraged and supported me and my sister Rhonda to progress in our chosen careers. I'm very pleased that you're here with me this evening. Thanks too to my Auntie Ruth, Auntie Marion and Uncle Dennis for being here this evening, and to my sister Rhonda and her family, and to all my in-laws. I know I'm very lucky to have such a wide and supportive extended family and very many close friends who have taken the time to be with me today. Over the years, many people have played important roles in my career development, and it's very nice for me that Professor Norma Reid-Burley, I think is in the audience with us, my first boss in the University of Ulster, so it's lovely to see Norma again. As we established INCORE and ARC, key support was provided by Professor Derek Burrell, my then head of School of Policy Studies, and thanks to Derek. Professor John Darby and Professor Murray Fitzduff and the former Vice-Chancellor, Professor McKenna, were all very supportive. Today, I've been very lucky to have the support of Professor Barnett, our current Vice-Chancellor, Professor Hannigan, and welcome this evening to her, PDC for Research, and everyone in Research Office. And of course our Dean, Professor Anne Moran, who is pivotal in helping us find ways to reach our objectives, and for whose support I'm most grateful for. ARC is joint with Queen's, as Anne has mentioned, and it's very special for me that Professor Elizabeth Meehan is here to give the vote of thanks. As former Director of the Institute of Governance, Public Policy and Social Research at Queen's, where ARC was based, she provided guidance and support at many difficult times and has always been a true champion for ARC, so thank you, Elizabeth. Many members of the ARC team at Queen's are also here. I'm not going to name them all individually, but I'm very happy that you're able to be with us this evening. As a team, we're also indebted to many funders who had faith in our vision and who invested accordingly, and to people working in the policy arena and the voluntary and community sectors. As Anne said, everyone who knows me knows that I have been incredibly lucky to work with great colleagues, and the current teams in INCORE and ARC are fantastic, both professionally and as friends, so thank you all. Finally, events like this just don't happen, and I must thank Alison Milne, Professor Allen, Caroline McNutt, Terry Kern, Brian Downey, Paddy Ann Leach, and everyone involved in the organisation for tonight. Okay, so on to the lecture. Different age, different attitude to community relations. Is this the case in Northern Ireland? What I'm going to try to do this evening is to look at this topic, or this title if you like, in the following way. Firstly, I'd like to explain why I chose this topic and why I think it's important. Secondly, I want to look at some of the evidence we have that enables us to examine it and what we actually need to examine it properly. Then we're going to take a look at what the results actually tell us before coming to a conclusion. So why this topic? Well, first, I believe it's important to place the researcher in context, and for personal reasons. As someone who lived what some might think a fairly sheltered life in the Republic of Ireland until I was 25, and then moved here to Derry, or Londonderry, when the troubles were decreasing but still very real, I never imagined I would work in this area of community relations. But inevitably, I think for social science researchers here, your more general social policy research interests become diverted into research around the Troubles. And a lot of the time since then has been spent trying to gain a better understanding of the causes, consequences, and importantly, understanding the lived experiences of people in Northern Ireland. As someone who did not grow up here, I am regularly reminded that it's difficult for an outsider to really understand all the intricacies. But hopefully my time here and the insights from people like you give me some authority to discuss these issues. The second thing that's influenced my area of research widely is the strong tradition of research into peace and conflict in this university. Within this university there are any number of very significant and influential research projects ongoing and that have been covered in the past, being done by individual researchers, groups and centres. And this research community is one which I'm proud to be a part of. But the main reason for my specific topic this evening is that I consider this to be one of the key issues facing Northern Ireland at this unique point in our history. Just to remind you, the Troubles, which broke out in 1968, but many argue go back generations, 800 years or more, saw over 3,600 people lose their lives and many more times that number injured. This was what is called a low-intensity conflict, in comparison, for example, to somewhere like Iraq, where more has been killed each month than we have had in the 30 years of conflict. But while it might be seen as low intensity, I would argue, along with many others, that in a population of 1.7 million, these deaths and injuries caused a high impact. Many, if not all families, will have known someone who died or was injured directly. And Dr. Maurice Hayes, in his Tip O'Neill lecture here earlier this year, quoting from his own review of David McKittrick's book, Lost Lives, eloquently summarises the extent of the deaths. And I quote, "They are all there, the victims, the grandfather and the babe in arms, the octogenarian and the twins in the womb, the last Viceroy of India and the Pakistani Sharwala, the lawyer and the litigant, tinker, tailor, soldier, sailor, rich man, poor man, beggar man, thief. There is too the appalling roll call of disaster, the sights of slaughter which dot the Ulster countryside in a litany of shame and suffering. There are indeed clusters in West Belfast and South Armagh, in the murder triangle of Mid-Ulster and the multiple interfaces of North Belfast. There is the Abercorn restaurant, the Four Steps Inn, McGurk's Bar and Graham's Bookie Shop, the Shankill Fish Shop, the Miami Show Band, King's Mills, Tiban, Ballygolly, the Mountain Lodge, Lamon, Loughlin Island, Cloddy, Grey Steel, Narrowwater, Enniskillen, Omagh, Bloody Friday, Bloody Sunday, Bloody Every Day. The bloody punctuation marks of the story of 30 years of strife." End quote. Sometimes, though, I think the very quantification of deaths into a summary number or list of events allows us to forget the individuals and the range of people affected. Malcolm Sutton's database, which is available on the Keane website, allows us to see who actually died. And, for example, on this date, the 5th of December, and I know you can't all read this, but I'm going to read it out for you. On this date, the 5th of December, over the years, 8 people lost their lives. For me, this is a powerful reminder that the statistics are real people from all walks of life. And with your permission, I'm going to read them out. William Bell, a 30-year-old Protestant, died in 1972. A civilian, he was killed by the British Army. Roy Hills, a British Army soldier, was killed by the official Irish Republican Army. William Bogle was killed in 1972. A Protestant member of the Ulster Defence Regiment was killed by the IRA. Joseph Craven, a 26-year-old Catholic, a member of the Irish National Liberation Army, was killed by the Protestant Action Force. John Todd, a 31-year-old Catholic, was killed in 1993. A civilian, he was killed by the Ulster Freedom Fighters. Brian Duffy, a 15-year-old Catholic, was also killed in that same attack. Jerry Devlin, a 38-year-old Catholic, was killed in 1997. A civilian, he was killed by the Loyalist Volunteer Force. And the most recent death actually happened in the year 2000 when a 35-year-old Protestant, Trevor Kell, was killed by a non-specific Republican group. I think the naming of names and the actual remembering that each one of these people had a family around them is very important. It's very easy to lose the individual face of the tragedy in Northern Ireland when you just talk about numbers. This is just one date over a 30-year plus period, and it demonstrates how the conflict resulted in such devastation, death and injury. What we also have to remember is that the conflict also cemented segregation, division and suspicion. This is the backdrop to where we are now. Here, in a very new Northern Ireland, the term historic is indeed overused, but who would have really believed that things could change so much? Yes, it has been slow, But the political situation which we now have was unexpected right up until the moment when it finally happened. I was actually with a colleague, Dr. Cathy Gormley-Heenan, in India when the Assembly went live earlier this year. And I can't tell you how surreal it was to be sitting there, seeing on TV and hearing from phone calls home that we actually had these laughing pictures of our First Minister and Deputy First Minister. As Duncan Murrow, Chief Executive of the Community Relations Council and a colleague here at Ulster, said when he was speaking just a few weeks ago, for the first time since partition, or probably before, we have a system of government in and for Northern Ireland to which there is no significant opposition. There is no serious insurgency, there is no rationale for unusual security measures. Instead, we have power sharing, commitment to equality and human rights, the principle of consent, and a police service for all. But this top level political activity is one thing. What do people like you and me think? Building sustainable peace requires more than elite agreements, and how the current and future generations living here get on with each other will influence our long-term future and the stability of the region. Building good relations with the other is still the preserve of too few people, too few unsung heroes who work tirelessly for change and a better future. In our work at INCORE, we are privileged to have the opportunity to see at first hand the incredible optimism, hard work, and most of all, determination to stick with this work for the long haul that so many of our voluntary and community sector leaders have. In this city, for example, we have many individuals and organisations like the Peace and Reconciliation Group, the Junction, St Collins Park House, Holywell Trust, and many others. On the other hand, many of us seem to see the problem as nothing to do with us at all. We say things like, it's in other areas, it's at the interfaces, it's never been a problem for me. In the same way that we do not recognise or admit that we may, in some way, have contributed to the past violence through our acts or through our omissions. If we are to have a genuinely different Northern Ireland, one where all are valued and all feel safe to contribute, it will need to take change throughout society at every level and in as many hearts as possible. The relative newness of our devolved institutions may be an excuse for the lack of progress in relation to the implementation of a shared future policy which has been set aside. It's an interesting time, and my concern is that our power-sharing government will not prioritise community relations work, community relations programmes, or resource them, simply because it's too difficult for them to reach an agreement on this topic, and it's easier to prioritise the much-needed economic development. But economic development, important as it is not enough. We need to do everything we can to ensure that the divisions are addressed and that people are enabled to find a better way forward. And of course this applies not just to the relationships between the Catholic and Protestant communities here, but also between them and the many other groups that now make up the interesting mosaic of our society. It's also beyond doubt that this transformation is not short-term work. Rather, it is ongoing for the long term. Prejudice, fear and suspicion do not disappear overnight. So that's why I chose the topic. Looking at the title, what exactly do I mean? Different age. I'm interested in looking at change over time. This is a different age, but I am also interested in differences between different age groups. Specifically, I am constantly struck by two simple and yet seemingly contradictory views that are held here in Northern Ireland. On the one hand, people say community differences don't matter so much to young people, with the often unsaid implication that things will somehow be different in the future and that a new and better Northern Ireland will simply emerge. However, on the other hand, the view that religion will always make a difference here implies the sectarianism and segregation we currently face in this divided region will continue regardless, and that the best we can hope for is that the severe violence will not return. But going back to my title, what is community relations? An often used definition comes from colleagues here in the University of Ulster, Karen Ivan, Duncan Murrow and Derek Wilson, who suggest in order for community relations to have any substantive meaning, it must be constructively linked with policies for equity and diversity. Likewise, if equity and diversity are to contribute to stability rather than heightened competition, they need to be brought together with an acknowledgement of interdependence between groups in Northern Ireland. Thus, community relations is generally defined as being based on three key principles, which are inextricably linked to each other. These three principles are diversity, interdependence, and equity. According to this broad definition, community relations work means promoting recognition, respect and tolerance for the variety of different communities within Northern Irish society, ensuring equality of opportunity and equality of access to resources, services and decision making, and developing a cohesive society in which different interests or identity groupings recognise their obligations and commitments to one another. It's important to note that while initially community relations was seen to be about relationships between the two main communities in Northern Ireland, it is now, with the changing composition of Northern Ireland society, taken to be about wider relations. However, in my talk this evening, I'm going to focus on the two main communities. Having been involved, as Anne referred to, in social attitudes research since 1989, what I want to do then is to take this topic as a case study and look at the evidence we have and the various ways through which we might try to use this evidence to see if indeed there are differences over time, and if there are age differences, and what do these mean. We have a lot of evidence in Northern Ireland. We have what are called quantitative approaches, and a lot of our time in ARC particularly has been spent trying to improve the range of quantitative materials available for this region, so that we have robust data sets that will allow in-depth research. There are also more qualitative approaches providing rich and deep insights into the issue. Let's begin by looking at some of the quantitative evidence available to help us address our question. The key data sets I'm going to use are those our teams have invested huge amounts of time and resources in developing. The first data set arises from the Northern Ireland Social Attitudes Survey series, which ran in Northern Ireland between 1989 and 1996. It was a sister to the ongoing British Social Attitudes Survey and involved a random sample of the population of about 900 people each year. Following the end of the Northern Ireland Social Attitudes Survey, we established what we call the Northern Ireland Life and Times Survey, which first ran in 1998 and has run annually since then. This survey is also a regular annual survey monitoring attitudes and opinions, and it currently works with a random sample of about 1,200 people each year. Within these two surveys there were a number of common questions, which have led to us developing a pooled data set called the Community Relations and Political Attitudes data set, which now holds information on 23,000 people. The final survey I'm going to mention, and I don't expect you to remember all of these, but just for your background information, the final survey is the Young Life and Times survey, which we see as really the daughter to Northern Ireland Life and Times. It's a survey of all 16-year-olds in Northern Ireland, so if your birthday's in February, and I know at least one or two of my nieces and nephews have been involved in this over the recent years, you get surveyed. And so far, about 3,300 young people have taken part. One of our concerns from the beginning has been to ensure easy access to our data via free online provision. So the ARC website gives full data sets and also summary descriptive tables. There are 6 key questions that have been covered over the years, and very often these are looked at in relation to differences between Catholics and Protestants. Tonight, however, I'm going to focus on these questions in relation to age category. These questions are now well established by government as key indicators on the state of community relations in the region. So, a few tables. The first figure I want to show will look at responses to the question on whether or not you believe that relations between Catholics and Protestants are better now than 5 years ago by age category. And this is the people who believe that they are better. So, what does this figure show? Can you see this? Yes, okay. What does this figure show? Some of you may know the general trends over time, but let's look at this in some detail. This question has been asked, let me just get this working. This question has been asked since 1989 all the way through to 2006. So we have 15 different surveys have been carried out over a 17-year period. The years then are along the x-axis and the percentage of green are along the y-axis. The first age group that I want to look at are the youngest age group. That is the 18 to 34-year-olds. In 1989, we can see that just under 30% of this age group thought relations between Catholics and Protestants were better than they had been 5 years ago. And by 2006, this had risen up to 58 or 56%, which is an important rise over this period. However, as you can see, this is not a straight line. It's not the full story. Just look at how opinions have fluctuated over the years. We see a fairly constant rise over the years up to 1995, which we might take to reflect the optimism around the emerging peace process and the 1994 ceasefires. But then a drop, followed by a slight rise in 1999. Remember, the Good Friday or Belfast Agreement was signed in 1998. And then a continued drop down to a low of just over 30% in 2001. Some of you may wonder, how can that be? We've had ceasefires, we've had an agreement. Why would public opinion suddenly drop so drastically in relation to how relations were between the two main communities? Well, many commentators have noted the problem that the excitement of the peace process is often not lived up to in the immediate aftermath of an agreement being signed, and so people can become negative or disillusioned. Many commentators on our peace process have also reflected on the fact that for many Protestants in particular, there was a huge sense of loss during this period. Post-agreement, people's expectations are high, and yet at a local level there can be very little sign of progress or change. Also, in 2001, many of you will remember the Holy Cross school dispute was ongoing at the time our survey was being conducted. And those negative images being broadcast across the media will surely have impacted on people's responses. I should note that we typically find that attitudes do not change that quickly, but they are nonetheless affected by current events. Since 2001, then, we see a significant rise in positive perceptions with a slight drop just in the last year. The increased push for devolution in the St Andrews Agreement may well be reflected in this, and the 2007 survey is currently in the field, so it will be very interesting to see what this year's results show. So then, what do you think? Do you think this age group, the 18 to 34-year-olds, will be much different in their beliefs to the older groups? And if so, in what way? I'm not going to ask you to guess. Let's just see here. The pink line is what I've called the middle age group, the 35 to 64-year-olds. And the yellow line, which I'm afraid probably isn't projecting as well as we'd hoped, is the older group, those who are 65 years or older. Now, it's always nice for social scientists when fairly clear trends emerge. And here you can see that generally the trend for both these age groups is similar to the younger age group that I've just described. But for the two older age groups, people are less positive, with the older group being the least positive. So the yellow line along the bottom is the older age group, and you can see that each year fewer of them believe that relations between Catholics and Protestants are better. The distance between the groups fluctuates over time, and at times is very little indeed. Nonetheless, we might begin to hypothesize that younger people are more positive, and this might be due to a range of factors. Less real experience of the worst of the conflict, perhaps, increasing secularization, being more liberal, the natural optimism of youth, and so on. So let's go on from here to look at the other key indicators to see if these initial thoughts hold true. A follow-on question asks about relations between Catholics and Protestants in the future. So we know what people think about in the last 5 years, what about in the next 5 years? Here we see a similar trend for young people. In 1989, under 30% felt relations would get better in 5 years' time, and this rose to a high point of 65% in 1995 and is now down to just over 50%. Again, this is a significant increase over the years. Looking at the two other age groups, we can see similar trends. But here the lines are closer together, so the difference between the age groups is not so great. And our early hypothesis that the youngest group may be most positive does not seem to hold true, because we can see that the middle age group, the pink line, is very similar to the 18 to 34-year-olds. And from about 1999 onwards, the middle age group actually seems to be slightly more positive in their opinion. Now let's turn to a different question directly related to the topic. We've asked a question, what do people think? Will religion always make a difference in Northern Ireland? As you can see, for the youngest age group, you can see very high levels of agreement. 90% of people aged 18 to 34 felt that religion would always make a difference in Northern Ireland in 1989. And this had dropped to 80% by 2004. A 10% drop is indeed significant, but it's still very high levels of agreement. Personally, I find this a staggering graph with such high levels of belief that religion will always make a difference. But perhaps I shouldn't be staggered. With our immediate history and ongoing divisions, perhaps this is what one might expect. What about the other age groups? Well, again, you may be surprised that it is the youngest age group, in this case, who are at the top. In other words, they are the most convinced that religion will always make a difference. The older groups are slightly less positive. But again, the groups are very close together over the years. Now, there's just 3 other questions that I'm going to look at, but I'm not going to go into such great detail. These 3 questions attempt to measure respondents' preferences for religious mixing in 3 areas: neighbourhood, workplace and schools. This first slide is looking at the people who say they would prefer to live in a mixed religion neighbourhood. Here we can see that the levels of preference for living in a mixed religion neighbourhood have remained high over the years. But in terms of age differences, it's the middle age group, the pink line, who are most in favour of this, with the youngest age group in more recent years actually being less likely to be in favour. What about mixed religion workplaces, which is what most of us who are in employment now are familiar with? Again, we see here that in relation to mixed religion workplace, a constantly high percentage of people are in favour. Although again, it's the middle age group who are most in favour over the years. And our last indicator is one which has been written about extensively by many researchers, including researchers in the audience here, is looking at people who say they would prefer to send their children to a mixed religion school. Levels of support here are not up at the 80–90%, but there is a majority of people in every year, in every age group, apart from the oldest age group in 93 and 98, a majority of people say that this is what they would prefer. However, again, it's the pink line, the middle age group, who are overall most in favour. One possible reason for the middle age group to be most positive on these last 3 indicators is perhaps that it's them who are actually out buying houses, deciding where to live. It's them who are working in the workplace, and it's they who are deciding where to educate their children. By now, many would rightly be asking, how good are these questions as indicators? These only ask opinion, and we know that actual behaviour is a different matter. For example, while many of us might aspire to mixed religion education for our children, there are any number of factors that impact on our final decision. Things like where we went to school ourselves, the academic ability of our child, the convenience of the school, where our child's friends are going, whether there's an integrated school in the area, and so on. However, concerns about these indicators do need to be borne in mind. Nonetheless, the durability and validity of these questions have been demonstrated over time, and also through more localised studies which have included them. As I said earlier, these indicators are now routinely used by government as indicators on the state of community relations and by researchers as a backdrop to their work. So far then, what do these indicators suggest in response to my title? Well, yes, there have been changes over time for all the age groups, and these changes have been significant and positive. The findings also indicate that there are age differences between the groups, but these differences are not always in the same direction, and so it suggests a complex story. For example, the younger age group are more optimistic about the state of community relations now than 5 years ago, but there's little difference between age groups looking to the future. Younger groups are most likely to think religion will always make a difference in Northern Ireland, and it is the middle age group who would most prefer mixed religion neighbourhoods, workplaces and schools. Now we could proceed in our analysis to look at age groups in more detail, say, for example, by religious breakdown or by social class or educational level, to try to understand this further. As I said earlier, much time has been spent by researchers looking at the differences between the 2 main communities in relation to these indicators. And to summarise very crudely that research, it has shown consistently that the Catholic community are more positive in their attitudes than the Protestant community. Other researchers have used these data sets to look at the relationship between cross-community activity and contact and attendance at integrated schools and how people perceive community relations. Again, summarising very crudely, that research has suggested that people who are involved in cross-community activity or who attend an integrated school are more positive in their opinions. One way to look at the complexity of the situation is to use the pooled data set and to do some cohort analysis. Instead of looking at small samples over the years, let's utilise the power of the larger combined data set of 23,000 individuals. So for example, if I take just one question Here I'm looking at the 3 cohorts by age and by religious breakdown. What I'd be interested in knowing is, why is this older group of Catholics different in their views to perhaps the youngest Protestant group? What is the difference here? One might argue that it's going to be the lived experience of those people, of the people in those age groups. And one way to examine this is to use a cohort analysis. So our earlier figures provided a year-by-year snapshot for each age group, but a cohort analysis allows us to look at things in a different way. A cohort is a group of people who share a common characteristic or experience within a defined time period. So I'm going to take 2 cohorts for the purposes of this lecture. I've selected a 1948 cohort. Some of you in this room may have been born in 1948. In other words, that's people who were born just after the war and who were 20 years old when the Troubles broke out, and so have lived for 20 years, their formative years, pre-Troubles. Then they've lived throughout the whole course of the Troubles and in the period of the peace process since then. The second cohort is those born in 1968. That is people who were born just at the outbreak of the Troubles. And so they grew up throughout their formative years in that violent environment. And they were 30 at the signing of the Belfast or Good Friday Agreement. The following quote from the Cost of the Troubles study by a young man in North Belfast, speaking in 1998, illustrates what I mean. Well, the age group we're all at, we grew up through the Troubles, and we all know somebody or have lost somebody very close to us. Everyone, maybe in North Belfast, would have, should it be a neighbour or an aunt, an uncle, a son, a cousin. You know, everybody's affected like. Everybody has their own story to tell. So let's look at these cohorts in terms of the key indicators again. And this is the last table, so you don't have to worry about focusing on too many more numbers. Let's look at the 1948 cohort first. Okay, just to remind you, these people were 20 at the outbreak of the Troubles, 50 at the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, and they're about 58 now. Just over a third of them think that relations between Catholics and Protestants are better now than 5 years ago. 4 in 10, or 39%, think relations will improve further over the next 5 years. However, 7 in 10, 69%, think religion will always make a difference in Northern Ireland. And you'll see in the last 3 rows that the majority would prefer to live in a mixed religion neighbourhood, 73%, 80% would prefer a mixed religion workplace, and 60% would prefer to send their children to a mixed religion school. What about our 1968 cohort? These people, remember, born at the outbreak of the Troubles, 30 at the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, and 38 now. They are indeed more positive in their belief that relations are better now, and also slightly more hopeful about future improvement. Yet they too believe that religion will always make a difference. Religion will always make a difference. And perhaps because they have lived through a time of increased segregation in area of residence, they are less positive than their older counterparts about living in mixed religion neighbourhoods, and also less likely to prefer a mixed religion workplace. However, they're slightly more in favour of sending their children to a mixed religion school. Just to add a further dimension to this, I've added in some 16-year-olds. That is, those born in 1990, using the data from the 2006 Young Life and Time survey. What might we expect here? These young people have lived half their lives since the signing of the agreements, and they have not lived through the worst of the Troubles. And what we find when we look at them is that they are the most positive about the improvements in community relations in the last 5 years. Remember, this is the generation who have been exposed to the Education for Mutual Understanding and Cultural Heritage programs, which began in schools in 1989. And so they could have been expected to have had an opportunity to take part in school-based cross-community projects. However, we see that they are the most likely age group or cohort to believe that religion will always make a difference in Northern Ireland. Fully 78% of them think that. Further, they're least likely to prefer mixed religion neighbourhoods, mixed religion workplaces, or mixed religion schools. Okay, so how significant could those last 3 findings be? Could we really expect 16-year-olds who have not yet had to make decisions about where to live, who have not yet been in the workplace for the most part, and who certainly don't have children for the most part, or thought about where they might go to school? How could we expect them to be able to answer these questions? So our cohort analysis then notes again age differences But again, these differences go in quite different directions. And for the younger age group, these are particularly interesting. So what more do we know about these young people? The evidence we turn to now is the rich qualitative material that allows a more in-depth look at the situation. There are a good number of important in-depth studies, but I'm simply going to draw from the comments that made by 16-year-olds in response to open-ended questions in the 2006 survey. The first thing to note is that they have plenty to say. 13 pages of comments in all. As you might expect, they range from quotes like this, which really show how much they hope for peace. I would like Catholics and Protestants to be at peace and stop all the fighting. I would like there to be peace in Northern Ireland. I don't understand it. I found it hard to understand in history class. They also express fears for the future. I feel that many people, especially my age, are very sectarian and very racist. I do not think things will improve at all, more than likely just get a lot worse. Perhaps naturally they tend to blame the older generation, their parents, politicians and so on. If parents didn't pollute their children's minds with sectarianism, Catholic-Protestant relations would improve. Community relations are generally poor. Most of the older community, the 30 plus, behave negatively towards people from different backgrounds. I hope my generation behaved more naturally and openly to different peoples and cultures. And the young people also suggest what we need to do. I feel that they should keep trying to bring the communities together, but feel it's not working at this time. There is not enough cross-community relations and activities to make young people more aware of the different races and religions in our society. And just at the bottom here, I'd like you to note my own family and friends in various guises. This was to keep David and Tori awake for the duration. Okay. So to conclude, what do we need when we try to look at these issues of age differences and attitudes in relation to community relations? I would argue we need robust quantitative data, and that's what our teams have been very active in trying to ensure. We need rich qualitative data, we need life stories. We need for this information to be widely available and easily accessible, and we need to disseminate it broadly. And we need those important policy research links. And what have we found? Yes, there have been changes over the years. So yes, different age, different attitudes. Yes, there are age differences. However, it's not clear that, however, there is little evidence to suggest that the young people are all that different from the older generations. Thus, there is evidence to support both sides of the debate that I mentioned earlier, that young people may provide a new future or that religion will always make a difference. And thus, I would contend that we need to be very concerned about the lack of commitment to developing new policies and procedures regarding community relations, because it's not obvious to me that things will change by themselves. And as a society, we need to work towards change. This is a time of opportunity, and again, quoting from Duncan, speaking just a few weeks ago, Duncan Morrow, the opportunity now is not to promote community relations as some sort of alternative industry, but to insist that transformation of our relationships needs to be part of any long-term strategy for a society worth living in, and that that is not an alternative to economic prosperity, but its essential partner. And so I conclude in the words of one young person: there is a definite need to improve relations as well as promoting good relations. Our role in the university is to work with other sectors to try to do this and to make our contribution to a better Northern Ireland. Thank you for your attention.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think we've had quite a number of insights into the current situation and how attitudes have developed over the years, and so many windows have been opened. And Gillian has kindly agreed to take a couple of questions before we move to the less formal part of this evening. So.
Sister-in-law from Calgary. Congratulations on a very interesting lecture. I work in the school sector, you know, and I'm interested in community relations, the financial end of it, because I find now the NUJUS, the education boards have now started to play a very lesser role in children's education going with different schools. So I think all the community relations money is going to the older sector of the community where it should start with the wee ones. And that should develop from there rather than most money you hear community relations is the older age group. The wee ones now seem to have been left behind, and I think that's where it should start. And I know the new trips in schools are getting fewer and fewer. When the kids start, there's a lot more trips. Schools will put the same priority in education as we do.
Well, I think that's a very good point, Linda, and I mean, I totally agree with you. And the whole point of my lecture is to say that I think in the last number of years there's been a community relations policy, which we've been through a whole review of community relations, a new shared future document was prepared and so on. But since our assembly has come in, that document has been put to one side and no alternative has come into place. And I think the key policy issue is whether or not government will invest in community relations. The programme for government is totally about economic development, and that is essential. I mean, there's no question, but that's a very important thing for the region. But I believe that economic development on its own is not enough. And I totally agree with you that cross-community contact and mixing and encouraging of that needs to happen as early as possible. And so I would be very concerned about cuts in budgets and do think that more resources need to be made available, and this needs to remain very much a priority for the region.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. In relation to the 16-year-old group, do you have any data when you split the respondents into those from integrated education, Protestant schools, Catholic schools, and are there any differences?
Actually, some of our colleagues, Bernie Hayes and Ian McAllister, have done quite a lot of work on that. And what they find very clearly is that children who have more opportunities for cross-community contact, and in particular children who attend integrated schools, are much more positive about their perception of community relations, much more open to the other, have many more friends from the other community, and so on. Now, other people would argue that, of course, that's because they already have parents who are more open and more liberal, and that's why they went to those schools. But it's certainly beyond dispute that attendance at integrated schools and being involved in mixed cross-community activity, be it through schools activities or outside schools, certainly does impact significantly on young people's attitudes.
Take one more.
Gender aspect of the data. I mean, I did not include any gender difference between like male and female, child or adults, or is that because there is no difference? I mean, what's the reason behind it?
Well, the reason I didn't speak about it is because there's just too many different things to speak about. As I said earlier in the lecture, Shala, most of the analysis has simply looked at the differences between Catholics and Protestants, so what do Catholics and Protestants say. So actually it was quite nice for me not to be drawing lines that were orange and green for a change, and to be looking at this by age group. I can't say categorically about the gender differences, but to the best of my knowledge there's no significant gender differences in relation to this, but it's not something that has been looked at in a lot of depth, and certainly is something that could be looked at in more detail.